We shall look at chapter 5, but I want to read a few verses first from chapter 3. Lamentations chapter 3, verse 39 and 40. Wherefore doth a living man complain, a man for the punishment of his sins? Let us search and try our ways and turn again to the Lord. Now, my subject matter this evening has been something that I've been mulling over in my mind for a number of weeks. And I'm persuaded that this particular book has a message for us in the midst of this pandemic. And so my subject this evening is submission to God's pandemic. I hope no one is going to roll their eyes. I do realize that it is a subject that we're weary of. And yet I do believe there is a message here that is needful, especially for the people of God at this time. I know few Christians who would not agree that the Lord has laid his hand upon the nations these past 2 years. The pandemic is a warning to a rebellious world. It is a shot across the bows of rebellious human society. There is a lot of complaint and criticism that we hear. Perhaps all of us are tempted to complain or to criticize at various points, and we're all weary of the restrictions. But what is the message that as Christians we ought to be sending to those who observe us? Now, I'm sure that there is a proper place to question government policy, to express our frustration at certain things that we have to experience. But despite the validity of those thoughts and conversations, I believe that the book of Lamentations tells us that there is something that ought to be much more prominent in our walk and conversation when it comes to this subject. And I hope that will become clear as we look at the subject here before us this evening. There are even voices being raised in our society of rebellion and revolt. And some of those voices have been raised even amongst Christians. But is that right, brothers and sisters? Governments have made and will make foolish decisions. There has been, without doubt, significant impact, social costs, mental health has been affected by the pandemic. The preaching of the gospel has been hindered. There's no doubt about that. It's been difficult to recruit children for our Sunday school. We invite people to our services and they have to wear a mask. And it can be very frustrating. But what ought to be the reaction of our society to this pandemic? And more particularly, what ought to be the reaction of those of us who are the people of God? We are to be salt and light. We are to set the example. The way we react, the way we conduct ourselves in the midst of these very trying times is to be the message of God. Remember, Paul said to the Corinthians, "You are my epistle," or God's epistle, known and read of all men. People watch Christians to see how they interpret and respond to these crises, the pandemic and the mayhem that it has brought upon our nation in particular. Well, how are we to respond to chastisement in general, personal chastisement? And how are we to respond to national chastisement? Now, of course, the chastisement that Jeremiah witnessed, God's hand laid upon Judah and Jerusalem, it proceeded from covenant love. They were his people, his chosen people. And in love, he dealt with their sin in order to bring them back to himself. When the Lord lays his hands upon our nation, we cannot say it's done in covenant love. That would be to lay his hand upon the church. But we can say that when God laid his hand upon this nation and all the nations in this pandemic, it was both an act of mercy and judgment. Judgment upon those who succumbed in death, however many or few that proves to be in the end, but also it is a voice of mercy to all whose lives are spared, because it's a reminder to us how vulnerable we are as a society to the hand of God. Now, Jeremiah is a great example to us. He is a voice to his nation in troubled times, in times of chastisement. He was an example to that nation, and therefore he must be an example to us, that we may know how to conduct ourselves in our day and generation when the Lord's hand is upon us nationally. The situation in Judah then, after the Babylonian conquest, is described in graphic terms in that chapter that we read. I'm not going to go through this whole chapter verse by verse, but simply to point out something of the nature of Jeremiah's sorrowful experience. He loved his people. He was not personally responsible for the calamity that they had experienced. He walked with God, but on account of the false prophets, the foolish rulers, the priesthood, and the people, God brought upon Jerusalem destruction. We see here in verse 3 that there were orphans, fatherless, widows. There was a social impact of this calamity. Then verse 5 speaks of weariness. We labor and have no rest. Then we see verse 8, a description of inept government. Servants have ruled over us. Now that may be a reference to the Assyrians and the Egyptians and others who began to take authority in the land. It may simply be that people who had no more than the caliber of servants, uneducated, were now the rulers of the land. It seems to be at least that in part. And he has to bewail the fact that the authorities of his society were not really fit and proper persons. We can identify with that perhaps. Verse 10 speaks of terrible famine. And we can turn back to chapter 4 and verse 4 that describes the tongue of the sucking child cleaving to the roof of his mouth for thirst. The young children ask bread, and no man breaketh it unto them. Verse 10 says the hands of the pitiful women have sodden or boiled their own children. They were meat in the destruction of the daughter of my people. These are acts of horror. And we may feel in our day, look at the fallout from the pandemic. A government that some would say is struggling to know what to do. Mental health going through the roof. Families being broken by stress and strain. Children missing out on education. But friends, it's nothing like the calamity that Jeremiah witnessed in his day. Verse 11 here in chapter 5, the women and the children abused. Verse 13, they took the young men to grind, the children fell under the wood as slaves. And verse 18, the most telling perhaps of all, is a description of the temple, Mount Zion, God's house, the place of worship. And he said, it is desolate, utterly destroyed. The foxes walk upon it. And we can turn back to chapter 2 and verse 6. You'll see in more detail. He has violently taken away his tabernacle as if it were a garden. He's destroyed his places of the assembly. The Lord has caused the solemn feasts and Sabbaths to be forgotten in Zion. Verse 7, he's cast off his altar, abhorred his sanctuary. This is a description of the fact that the Babylonians had destroyed the temple. They'd sacked it of the gold, the silver, the brass, and all the holy vessels and taken them away. My friends, Jeremiah's experience is far worse than ours, and I'm sure you will agree that. But what is even more telling is Jeremiah saw this day coming before it happened. He foretold it to the people. And he also told the people how to respond. We may be surprised. We haven't really time this evening to look at all the verses. But Jeremiah, seeing what would happen before it happened, warning the people that they needed to recognize that God's hand was going to fall upon them in judgment and in chastisement. He doesn't advocate a resistance movement. In fact, he says the very opposite. He said, you must submit. You must fall into the hands of the Babylonians, and God will give you your life in return. He didn't advise taking up arms in order to defend the temple and its worship and its priesthood and its practices. I'm sure there must have been those in Jeremiah's day that said, we cannot see God's house fall into the hands of the heathen. We cannot see these things completely destroyed. We must take a stand. But Jeremiah said no. He told them to surrender to the Babylonians. We could perhaps look at one verse. Jeremiah chapter 21 and verse 9. But there are more. This is just one. And he says here, he that abideth in this city shall die by the sword, and by the famine, and by the pestilence. But he that goeth out and falleth to the Chaldeans that besiege you, he shall live, and his life shall be given unto him for a prey. For I have set my face against this city for evil, and not for good, saith the Lord. It shall be given into the hand of the king of Babylon, and he shall burn it with fire. Now, of course, this was an unpopular message. These were patriotic Jews. And although they had fallen into idolatry, they held their temple in high regard. They held their city in high regard. And Jeremiah was politically incorrect when he said to the people, you've got to surrender to the Babylonians, to these heathen idolaters. It was the last thing they wanted to do. It went against the very grain of all their thoughts and convictions. And they put him in prison, in the dungeon. Young people, you'll remember that from your Sunday school lessons. But really, that was the message. You need to submit. Well, what was Jeremiah's attitude? Now Jerusalem has fallen. That's what it was. But now Jerusalem has fallen. The temple has been virtually destroyed. And here in the book of Lamentations, we see the spirit of Jeremiah as an exemplary believer coming through. And I think this is something that has much to say to us in our current situation. The first thing we can draw from chapter 3, I should have said to you before I began, I meant to. This book is remarkable in that it's written in Hebrew poetic form. Each chapter, other than chapter 3, has each verse begins with a letter of the Hebrew alphabet. In chapter 3, it's 3 times as long because 3 verses followed by 3 verses by 3 verses begin with consecutive letters of the Hebrew alphabet. And not only, and it's beyond me and I'm sure all of you to appreciate the beauty of the Hebrew language here, but why was it written like this? So that it could be memorized. We don't turn to this book very often, but this was to be memorized, possibly even sung. People were to remember the spirit that Jeremiah expresses, almost as a lone voice in the midst of these sorry times in the land of Judah. And the first thing we see here is that Jeremiah recognized that God was behind all that had happened. Lamentations chapter 3 and verse 1. I am the man that hath seen affliction by the rod of his wrath. He has builded against me. He has set me in dark places, 5 and 6. He has hedged me about, verse 7. Now, of course, Jeremiah personally suffered. He suffered in the dungeon. He suffered the abuse of his countrymen. And this chapter really speaks of both his own personal sufferings, but also the sufferings that he endured as part and parcel of his nation. We'll see that as we go through. But the point is that not just the destruction of Jerusalem, but all the hardships that had followed, the famine, the bondage, the bereavements, the distress, all of it, he recognizes is the hand of the Lord. The Lord has been behind it. And surely that's where we need to begin in these days. Sometimes I hear people say, yes, but look what's happened as a result of lockdowns. There's been so much stress, so much disorder in families. Yes, there has. And I'm not saying whether that was right or wrong as a political decision, but all the mayhem that has been brought in as a result of the pandemic is God's doing. He's permitted it. He's appointed it. And the catalogue of ills that we can acknowledge, we must acknowledge that God is behind them. He's permitted government to make perhaps poor decisions that have exacerbated certain situations. That was the case for Jeremiah too, friends. But we do not see here that Jeremiah blames his rulers. He looks beyond them. Now I'm sure, and we can see this in the book of Jeremiah, there were times when he warned the ruling class. He would have lobbied for better policies. But ultimately, that's not the first thing you see about Jeremiah here. What's prominent is the recognition that God had appointed the malaise that he had to go through with his people. And that's, I think, how we should be seen. We can have our personal political opinions, but ultimately people need to realize that we as Christians recognize that God has laid his hand upon us, and all the distress and tensions and heartache are as a result of God's sovereign will. They're a warning to our society that God is not pleased with us, and we are part of that society too. Secondly, or before we move on, we see here, look at verse 20. Jeremiah humbled himself before God. Verse 19, he says, remembering mine affliction and my misery, the wormwood and the gall, My soul hath them still in remembrance and is humbled in me. It's true of his personal trials, but true of that sorrow and misery that he experienced as part and parcel of his nation. We must humble ourselves and be an example to others. We are not to be proud and defiant. We must be very careful before we utter too much complaint, because ultimately, if we believe God has appointed it, our complaints rise far higher. They arise to God himself. Secondly, we see here that Jeremiah acknowledged that God's hand was upon the nation. Not only that God was behind it, but God's hand was upon the nation of Israel or Judah on account of their national sin. In Lamentations chapter 1 and verse 18, there is a cry raised in verse 18. The Lord is righteous, for I have rebelled against his commandment. Who's speaking here? Well, Jeremiah is speaking rhetorically of the city. This is Jerusalem crying out as a city, saying, as a city I have rebelled against God's commandments. And he's going to go on rhetorically to speak as if he was the city, to say God has put his hand upon us because of our sin. Look at chapter 4 and verse 13. The kings of the earth and all the inhabitants of the world would not have believed that the adversary, the enemy, in other words, the Babylonians, and the enemy should have entered into the gates of Jerusalem. For the sins of her prophets and the iniquities of her priests that have shed the blood of the just in the midst of her. Jeremiah makes no bones about it. Yes, God has allowed it, but he's allowed it for the reason. The sins of the people and the prophets of our land, the atheistic voices, the priests who give people peace through all sorts of foolish ways. Not literal priests, I don't mean. The sins of the nation are what has brought God's judgment, surely, upon us. Chapter 3 and verse 42. We have transgressed and have rebelled. Thou hast not pardoned. Now, whether it is the virus or the resulting mayhem that has been brought in, we need to be careful before we say it is nothing. In Hebrews chapter 12, the writer quotes from Proverbs 3, and he says, my son, despise not the chastening of the Lord. What does that mean, to despise the chastening of the Lord? Well, if we chasten one of our children, or when we were children, if we were punished or chastened by our fathers, to despise it is just to pretend it didn't hurt and walk away and shrug our shoulders and say, so what? And there is a danger, friends, that even amongst Christians, that spirit has shown its head. Oh, it's nothing. I believe it is something. It's caused no end of trouble. It's caused a dent in our economy. And I'm not talking about the science of whether the latest variant is milder and it's nothing, but we must be careful because the Lord has laid his hand upon us. And the example that we must give, I'm sure, to those around us is that the Lord is judging us for our sin as a nation. And if we despise the chastening of the Lord, we invite further chastisement. It's not right to say, oh, it's nothing. That's the spirit of a rebellious child who doesn't want to admit that the smack he had has hurt. And as Christians, we must say, no, the Lord, like Jeremiah here, the Lord has laid his hand upon us. I am the man has seen affliction by the rod of his wrath. The opposite of despising chastisement is to take it seriously and say, yes, my Father is sending me a message that I shouldn't live like that. I shouldn't answer him back like that or whatever. And this is the message of God to me as a member of my society in 2022, is that God doesn't like the way my society is living. Jeremiah had to feel the pain of that, and perhaps we have to as well. But thirdly, Jeremiah was an example of submission. Look at verse 26 here, chapter 3. It is good that a man should both hope and quietly wait for the salvation of the Lord. It is good for a man that he bear the yoke in his youth. He sitteth alone and keepeth silence, because he hath borne it upon him. He putteth his hand in the dust, if so be there may be hope. He giveth his cheek to him that smiteth him. He is filled with reproach. Now that's not everything that is here. There's trust as well. But what is here above all is a spirit of submission and resignation to the Lord. That's how Jeremiah behaved in the midst of these most sad and painful times in Judah. He bore the yoke. He sat alone. He kept silence. He didn't keep complaining about this and that or the other. He didn't say, well, we should have done this or we should have done that. He bore it alone. There was a spirit of submission. And when the Jews, during this period, made plans to get themselves out of their situation, they said, we're going to call on Egypt, and then we will break the yoke of the Babylonian masters. And Jeremiah said, you will fail and you will suffer. You have to remain here in Jerusalem. You have to submit to the appointment of God in his providence, and ultimately he will bless you. But don't say in your own strength you're going to get out of this mess. Isn't that the spirit of our age to a certain extent? We'll sort things out. Well, God in his mercy may permit that. But as Christians, we submit to the Lord. We look to him for deliverance. He was an example of submission. Fourthly, I've got 7. I'll be quicker with the remaining ones. Fourthly, we see that Jeremiah here didn't complain. He lamented the suffering, but he declined to complain. Verse 39, our text. Wherefore doth a living man complain? A man for the punishment of his sins. If we recognize that God's hand is upon us as a nation, then as Christians, we ought not to be ringleaders in complaint, but rather ringleaders in submission. I'm not saying that we shouldn't lament the suffering and the difficulty. Jeremiah catalogues all of that, but he didn't complain about God. He didn't complain about his government. He simply complained to the Lord. He lamented to the Lord, and there's a big difference. When we are chastened, we can pour out our soul to the Lord for the grief, the pain, the difficulties that we find such a burden. It's only natural. We tell him of our bereavements, of our griefs, but we complain to him. We do not complain of him. And here Jeremiah is saying that. Can we complain when the Lord brings a pandemic and all the calamities associated with it for our sin? The answer is obvious, and it's implicit here. No, we should not. But rather, and this is the next point, let us search and try our ways and turn again to the Lord. That ought to be our message to those around us. We search our ways. We make sure that we distance ourselves from the sins of the age. And we turn to the Lord and keep close to him. Sixthly, that was the fifth one. The sixth one, we see that there is in Jeremiah here, and this is important too, an awareness of the continued faithfulness and mercy of God. Verse 22, it is of the Lord's mercies that we are not consumed, because his compassions fail not. They are new every morning. Great is thy faithfulness. These are well-known verses, but do we appreciate that Jeremiah uttered these in the midst of great sorrow and great calamity, when he'd witnessed the orphaning of children, the enslaving and the ravishing of young women, when he had seen great misery, and yet he can look beyond it all and say, it is of the Lord's mercies that we are not consumed. His compassions fail not. A Christian is realistic. We recognize and submit to the sovereign will of God, but we are not defeatist. We are not those who have no hope. We look beyond this world. We know that God is still a merciful God, and we must declare this. And we must point others who are going through the heartache and the pain, as Jeremiah did here, to a God who is still faithful. He never lost his confidence in God. And that's the last point, verse 7. The seventh thing about Jeremiah's spirit here, he had hope and confidence in God. Verse 31, the Lord will not cast off forever, but though he cause grief, yet will he have compassion, according to the multitude of his mercies. When others lose hope, the people of God retain their confidence, and we may encourage others to seek God and find confidence in him. That must be our message. Hebrews 12 says, despise not the chastening of God, neither faint when thou art rebuked of him. That means to give up, to drop our hands, to sink to our knees. The believer does not need to be of that spirit. We submit, but at the same time we persevere, trusting in the Lord. It's so discouraging that I have to stand here and see you all in masks. I don't like it, but it's God's appointment. And we are not defeated. We submit to his will that has placed us in this situation, but we can look beyond that. We can look to God, who is our sovereign God, who will triumph gloriously and eternally. Well, what did Jeremiah not do? I just want to end with this. Jeremiah blamed the rulers and their current policies for the calamities that he had come into. I'm not saying that they weren't in some way culpable, and neither am I saying that the authorities of our land are not culpable for inflaming the situation in certain things. It may prove that they are. But Jeremiah didn't let those things become a distraction from what he believed to be the right spirit in which to approach the hardship that he, along with his people, had to experience. He didn't complain. He submitted. He acknowledged the Lord in it. And he placed his confidence in God. Secondly, he didn't advocate a defense of the temple at all costs. Now, people have said to me, yes, but Pastor, it's impacting upon our worship. It's impacting upon our Sunday school and our gospel work. We ought to be free to do these things as we always had. And if the government dares to interfere, then we should rebel. Well, Jeremiah knew what would happen to the temple. It was the apple of God's eye, in a sense. It was the place of his testimony. The Ark of the Covenant would be taken away. the whole witness of God upon earth would be stilted and stunted. But Jeremiah didn't say, look, trouble's coming. You need to surround that temple, even if you lose everything else. Jeremiah said, even the destruction of the temple was God's doing. He permitted it. Look at verse 1 in chapter 4, and I will move to conclusion. How is the gold become dim, the most fine gold changed? The stones of the sanctuary are poured out in the top of every street. The precious sons of Zion, comparable to fine gold, how are they esteemed as earthen pictures? And the description here is of God's house, God's people, laid waste. And just as God allowed in that time period for his own gospel testimony, which is what the temple was, to be damaged, God's chastisements upon us at the moment, they may mean that gospel work is affected. But the message of Jeremiah through Lamentations is not that we must rise up and revolt, but rather we have to accept that the Lord has laid his hand upon the nation, and even the church's work is hampered. Now, I'm not saying, please don't get me wrong, I'm not saying we should never stand and defend the church. I'm not saying that we should never make a stand if it proves that our government is deliberately suppressing the work of the gospel. There may come a time, but we shouldn't jump to that conclusion. There are times when we have to say, as a result of the Lord's chastening hand upon the nation, even our worship is affected. Well, may the Lord bless these things to us. I'm not intended to be controversial. And really, my burden is that we recognize that whatever our differences of opinion, when it comes to the nuances of policy, what people need to see and hear from Christians is these prominent dispositions, an acknowledgement that God is sovereign, that we are submissive to his will, that we recognize that his hand has gone out against our nation and many other nations, and that we submit to him, but we haven't lost hope in him. We trust him and the everlasting gospel of Jesus Christ and his mercy and love for days to come. Amen. Our closing hymn is 499. Why should I fear the darkest hour or tremble at the tempter's power? Jesus vouchsafes